Modern power. Modern power has a public relations problem. It insists repeatedly and with increasing sophistication that it no longer has a center. Decisions are described as emergent, systemic, procedural. Responsibility is displaced into frameworks, committees, algorithms, or market forces. When harm occurs, it is attributed to failures of process rather than acts of will. Power, in other words, has learned to speak in the passive voice. Welcome. This is an essay about Blofeld in Spectre. And yes, Spectre is my all-time favorite Bond film. Espionage fiction exists in part as a refusal of this grammar. It restores agency to the world by insisting that someone, somewhere is responsible. James Bond has always been less a fantasy of violence than a fantasy of legibility. The belief that the world's dangers can be identified, confronted, and resolved because they have authors. Villains matter in Bond, not because they are evil, but because they claim authorship. Ernst Stavro Blofeld is the purest expression of this function. He is not merely a recurring antagonist. He is the franchise's most explicit answer to the anxiety that power has become invisible. His persistence across decades and the significance of his long absence reveals something essential about how the Bond films respond to changing political and technological realities. Blofeld returns when abstraction becomes intolerable, when the denial of agency itself begins to feel like a lie. Blofeld's disappearance from the Bond films for several decades is often explained as a matter of legal misfortune. Rights to the character and the organization Spectre were entangled in a prolonged dispute following Kevin McClory's involvement with Thunderball. The result was that Blofeld, one of the most recognizable villains in popular cinema, became unusable. The series continued, but without its central adversary. This absence, however, coincided with a far more consequential transformation. The world that produced Blofeld in the early 1960s was structured by Cold War symmetry. Power was centralized, ideological, and readable. Intelligence agencies mirrored one another. Criminal organizations mimicked state hierarchies. Blofeld fit naturally into this environment because he resembled the systems he opposed. Bureaucratic, hierarchical, theatrical. By the late 20th century, that symmetry had dissolved. Power no longer announced itself through ideology, but through infrastructure. Corporations rivaled states. Financial instruments replaced armies as tools of coercion. Intelligence work shifted from espionage toward data aggregation. Violence became increasingly asymmetric, fragmented, and deniable. In such a world, a singular mastermind seemed almost naive. The Bond films adapted accordingly. Villains ceased to resemble emperors or generals and began to look like intermediaries. They were financiers, brokers, ideologues, technicians. They did not claim responsibility so much as exploit opportunity. Organizations like Quantum were deliberately abstract, defined more by function than by identity. The absence of Blofeld thus mirrored a broader cultural insistence that no one was truly in charge anymore. Blofeld as the ultimate mad villain at the beginning and at the end of history. The Daniel Craig era, which is my personal favorite era, I know that's unpopular to say in modern Bond fandom, but if I've learned anything about Bond fandom over the years, it's that everyone hates the newest thing. The second the next Bond shows up, everyone will say, "Oh man, I sure miss Daniel Craig." That's the way it always goes. It's ultimately predictable and shallow. The Daniel Craig era is often described as a period of realism or psychological depth, an exercise in deconstructing manufactured masculinity, but its defining feature is actually structural. These films repeatedly confront Bond with enemies who deny authorship. Le Chiffre does not believe himself evil. He is a facilitator of risk. Dominic Green frames exploitation as environmental, as economic necessity.
Hello, James.
Silva casts his vendetta as the logical consequence of bureaucratic betrayal. Even Quantum presents itself as a loose network rather than a command structure. What unites these antagonists is not ideology, but deflection. Each insists that responsibility lies elsewhere, in markets, in governments, in systems too complex to control. Some even claim, like Silva, that they are victims of ideology and responsibility. Bond, as an agent licensed to kill, becomes increasingly out of place in this environment. His role presumes a world in which threats can be named and neutralized. Instead, he is confronted with effects rather than causes. By the time Spectre arrives, this strategy has reached exhaustion. The films have meticulously mapped the terrain of post-Cold War power, but they have also generated an unease they cannot resolve. If everyone is merely an intermediary, then accountability evaporates. If evil is always systemic, then resistance becomes symbolic rather than effective. Spectre responds to this impasse not by rejecting modernity, but by reintroducing authorship into it. To understand Blofeld's return, his grand return, one must understand how surveillance has evolved. Early surveillance was personal and visible. It involved watching bodies, intercepting communications, following individuals through space. Its purpose was knowledge of the present and past. Late 20th century surveillance shifted toward prediction. The collection of metadata allowed institutions to identify patterns, correlations, and probabilities. What mattered was not what someone said, but how often, to whom, and in what context. Surveillance became statistical rather than narrative, and if you know what they are looking for, then you know how to look. In the 21st century, surveillance has taken another step. It no longer merely predicts behavior, it shapes it. Algorithms curate information environments. Risk assessments influence policing, credit, employment, and travel. The boundary between observation and intervention collapses. Surveillance becomes ambient, infrastructural, and continuous. Frameworks like Five Eyes exemplify this transformation. They are not conspiratorial cabals, but philosophical commitments. Information is treated as a shared resource and security as a problem of total visibility. The logic is managerial, rather than authoritarian. More data produces better outcomes. Oversight becomes redundancy. Secrecy becomes inefficiency. Tools such as NSO Group's Pegasus spyware illustrate the end point of this logic. Pegasus is disturbing not because it spies necessarily, but because it dissolves boundaries. It collapses the distinction between device and body, between private thought and geopolitical relevance. Surveillance ceases to be an act and becomes an environment. Blofeld's genius within Spectre is his understanding that this environment still requires authorship. Systems do not run themselves. Someone designs them, exploits them, and benefits from them. Where C believes in inevitability, Blofeld believes in intention. And every great postmodern film experiment needs a character who claims authorship. Every surveillance state requires a designer. Andrew Scott's C represents a new kind of antagonist, one uniquely suited to contemporary anxieties. He does not seek domination or revenge. He seeks efficiency, coded as power. His language is that of optimization, integration, and oversight. Moral questions are reframed as technical problems. C is dangerous precisely because he does not perceive himself as dangerous. He believes that authority, once embedded in systems, becomes neutral. That automation absolves responsibility. That surveillance, if universal, cannot be abusive. His faith is not ideological, but procedural. Blofeld recognizes the weakness in this faith. Management without authorship creates vulnerability. Systems without acknowledged centers invite capture. C builds the machine. Blofeld understands how to inhabit it. C is a visionary like Blofeld himself. People have historically devoted themselves to tentacles of power and formed organizations into schematics of authority. Blofeld has never evolved in the way other Bond villains have. He has adapted. In Fleming's novels, he is obsessive, meticulous, and deeply personal. Donald Pleasance's portrayal in You Only Live Twice emphasizes bureaucratic terror in beautifully cartoonish ways. Power exercised through distance and ritual. There's always something deeply ritualistic about Blofeld, which I think speaks volumes about the space of secretive authority in which he occupies. His throne, so to speak. On Her Majesty's Secret Service reimagines him as a mastermind relic of cartoonish violence. By the 1970s, Blofeld becomes excessive, even absurd. Diamonds are forever, for your eyes only. These reduce him to spectacle or self-parody. I still find him enjoyable, yet this degeneration is instructive. Once Blofeld becomes entertainment rather than threat, he loses his function. His disappearance is not a loss, but a necessity, ultimately. Christoph Waltz's Blofeld restores restraint. He is not flamboyant in the way Javier Bardem's Silva was in Skyfall. And I do love Silva in Skyfall, but so we can contrast the two villains. Where Silva was a hypersexual nihilist, Spectre's Blofeld appears to be a post-sexual surgeon with the entire criminal body politic as his operating table. He enjoys many moments of psychotic curiosity and hyperfixation, but even his mania is ultimately clinical. He does not seek attention. His calm is not emptiness, but completion. He behaves like someone who no longer needs recognition because the world already reflects his methods. In fact, the entire James Bond series is a reflection of his mad villainy. James is the cuckoo who keeps invading Blofeld's carefully constructed universes of crime. His shadow who reminds him of the version of himself that is dead. James is the cuckoo that is driving Blofeld insane. James is the parasite in Blofeld's systems. He's always been the cuckoo in his nest. The most controversial moment in Spectre is Blofeld's assertion that every enemy Bond has faced was part of his design. Taken literally, I can understand this claim strains credibility. Taken structurally, it clarifies the film's argument. Blofeld is not claiming tactical control over every event. He is claiming conceptual authorship. Each prior villain represents a partial manifestation of modern power. Finance, resources, information, networks. Blofeld synthesizes them. He names the center that the films had previously refused to acknowledge. This is why the brother revelation matters less psychologically than mythologically. Bond and Blofeld are rival outcomes of the same world, of the same genre trappings, of the same universe. One is licensed by the state, the other operates well beyond it. Their conflict is not personal, but archetypal. Bond and Blofeld, like Holmes and Moriarty, or Batman and Joker, are destined to clash until the bitter end. They are brothers in a postmodern sense, in that they are intimately connected in a way that is deep. Cuckoo. Blofeld's cruelty is not physical, but narrative. I do believe that the cruelest thing that can be done to you is imposing a narrative upon you, is designing a life, is removing self-authorship or autonomy. And Blofeld is removing the self-authorship of entire nations full of individuals. He targets Bond's history, relationships, and sense of self. Blofeld historically, within the films, shows up to prevent Bond from completing a well-formed personal character arc. Bond is married, Blofeld must kill Tracy Bond. And I know that this video is dedicated to Spectre, but he's fascinating in No Time to Die as well with his rather limited screen time. He's mostly frustrated and aggravated by Bond within that film, because he can tell Bond is about to complete the most tragic and revealing and human arc of all. And this deeply disturbs Blofeld. Without his ability to author Bond's life, he feels like a fraction of a man. This reflects a broader transformation in how power harms. In a world where identity is data, exposure replaces execution. To control someone's story is to control their future. Information warfare is intimate because it collapses distance. It makes the personal political by default. Blofeld understands that terror no longer requires spectacle. It requires certainty. It requires authorship. Bond villains have traditionally been marked by physical deformity, a visual language that equates power with distortion. Blofeld's scar is restrained, almost tasteful, in a macabre and cruel way, in a very gothic way. It signals proximity to violence without direct indulgence in it. He has been shaped by power, not visually consumed by it. The octopus that symbolizes Spectre reinforces this reading. It does not dominate through hierarchy, but through reach. Its intelligence is distributed. It envelops rather than conquers. Blofeld does not rule the world from above. He saturates it. He guides the tentacles. Blofeld endures because he articulates something that modern systems attempt to deny, that power, however abstract, still benefits someone. His return in Spectre is not a regression to Cold War fantasy, but an acknowledgement that diffusion has limits. At a certain point, abstraction demands a face. Not because it's accurate, but because it's necessary. In restoring Blofeld, the Bond films do not simplify the modern world. They render it legible again. And in doing so, they reaffirm the central promise of espionage fiction, that even in an age of systems, responsibility has not disappeared. It has merely learned how to hide. I have zero shame in saying Spectre is my favorite Bond film. I believe people treat the film unfairly and in bad faith. People seem to be unable to read Spectre correctly, or they are deliberately refusing to try. I think Spectre is a beautiful experience, and it's the Bond film I watch most. I deeply love Blofeld. I think he's a fantastic character, and I feel that Spectre, Christoph Waltz's performance, is mesmerizing, even hypnotic. Gives me Blofeld in a way I had never anticipated before. In a way that truly feels immersive. Thank you for watching me. I am the rejected Bond villain.